I am sure that there are millions and millions of people sitting on the edge of their seat, dying to hear what we've got to say. And today, it is the history of surprise stare games in an act of incredible narcissism. Both Alan and Tony have asked me to rake over their histories and hopefully bring up some nuggets. So to begin, I'll just introduce our two guests, the founders and steerers of Surprise Stare Games. We have Mr. Alan Paul. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And we have Lady Honey Blunt.
Hello. Hello. Yes.
So where I want to start is before Surprise Stare Games, before you two met each other. What is your history in gaming? How did you come through games into the hobby arena? What was the journey that brought you to the place where you might even consider designing games? We'll start with Alan.
Yeah, because I'm the oldest. So yeah, I mean, well, my history in gaming starts with family games at Christmas, and in the old days, that didn't involve any kind of computers or anything like that. It was all analog, so it's all Waddingtons. Well, am I allowed to say the M word, Monopoly? Or
without wishing to embarrass, what kind of date are we talking here?
Well, I was born in 1957, and then the dinosaurs came, and then they all died out. So by the time I was about 11, so what is that, 68, something like that, I designed my first shambolic attempt at a game. But the thing that encouraged me to do it was a game called Formula One, which probably nobody's heard of. It was an old Waddington's, I think it was racing game, where the great thing about that was it wasn't just roll and move. It wasn't roll and move at all. You had a little what do you call it, a monitor thing, a cardboard thingy, where you decide on what speed you were going to go, and that's the amount of spaces you moved around the track. And the inside track was shorter, as you'd expect, but you also had tire wear and brake wear gauges, and you could use your tire wear and brake wear to reduce your speed so you could go around the corners, and the corners all had specific speeds that if you exceed them, you had a chance of spinning off and bad things happening. So it had some quite sophisticated elements of how you might control your car, but it also had a bunch of cards, and the cards were all special things. The one most people remember, if they played it, is the one called Superb Driving. So that allows you to go around a corner at any speed. It's kind of take that for Formula One. I can go around this 30-mile-an-hour corner at 160, and I'm so great I can do it. And I thought, well, some of these mechanisms are really, really fun, interesting things. And I thought I can probably do something like this in the arrogance of youth. I thought, wouldn't it be fun?
You were 11 and you were thinking thoughts like that. I was thinking about why did pictures of ladies make me feel funny downstairs? And you were thinking about designing a motor racing game. What the hell with you?
Hell, I was never cool, Tony. I was never one of the cool kids at all. That
was not being cool, I could tell you.
I was a spotty geek. I designed a game which was terrible, but I remember the really nice thing about it. It was I put it in a Mirage, a box of a Mirage plane. That looked really cool because I did plastic modeling as geeks did in those days, and that's still around in my archive.
I was going to say, Alan, all of us game designers got pictures of us when we were models, when we were modeling. Exactly. We needed the money, Alan. We needed the money.
Needed that money. And so, have games, did you ever go through, often you see the evolution of a gamer is that they'll be really into it when they're young, and then they'll have a fallow period where they think that they've got to assume the mantle of adulthood. Was that the case with you, or did you always play games constantly throughout your life?
Was that in the tone? Oh, me. Okay. I always
to you.
Sorry, I was talking to me. No, yeah, I always played. I was the one member of the family, and it was mainly family games, you see, who would always say at Christmas time, "Yeah, we need to get a game out," or sometimes even not at Christmas. It's ridiculous. Playing games not at Christmas. How mad! And we used to play. I was a war gamer as well.
You're ticking all the boxes now.
I have all the boxes. I have endless geek credentials. Yeah. So, and we used to. Well, back in those days, you're talking late 60s, early 70s. If you're playing war games, there's no rules because there's no, you can't just go to the internet and download a set of rules or anything. So nobody had access to any rules. You could maybe, if you were lucky, find somewhere and they could mail order you something. They could post it to you. But since a lot of wargaming was done in America, that was pretty much inconceivable. So we had to invent our own rules. So we did. So you have little handwritten books of all the rules that we would do, and combat results tables all scrawled in pencil.
And we have
So
this
that's how I got
picture.
into. That's how I got into it, really. Yeah.
Yeah, we have this picture of wargamers being a particular breed of person, and unhealthy
Yeah.
with the firing mechanisms of Luger pistols and that sort of stuff. I mean, what was the wargaming community like when you were going through it in sort of late 60s, early 70s? I assume it was a pretty much middle-aged male, not a lot of showering pursuit, right?
Yeah. I mean, at that point, it was very small and inbred, definitely. It was fundamentally geeky people who liked to find out about the stats of tank armor, and tank guns. It was all about that kind of thing. No, but I was mixing with the same kind of weird wargamer people. We were much of the same age. The older people who were the kind of gurus of wargaming wouldn't fraternize with those because they were like miles above us. And besides, travel was more difficult. I used to dream of going to the next village. No, it was a totally different time.
Tony, you're landed gentry, and you're a rural individual. When did gaming enter your life? Was it always a thing, or did it come to you later at college or something like that?
Well, no, it was there. I mean, I remember getting board games given to me at Christmas, which is obviously the traditional British time of dealing with board games. And I've had a couple of acquisitions recently for my forthcoming board gaming museum, date to be announced. And I look at it and go, hang on, I'm pretty sure I had that game when I was about 8 or 9 years old, mid to late 70s. So there were a lot around, but I don't remember actually playing them very much. And it was only really when I went to college and discovered D&D and then board gaming on the side. And then during my year out, when we were not role-playing, we were board gaming. So Risk, Diplomacy, Blood Royale, and so on. So I really began to get into board games. And then we discovered Shogun, or Samurai Swords / Yakuza. And that was the game really that we adored as a group. So we were either role-playing on a Sunday or we were playing Yakuza on a Wednesday into the evening. And maybe if we were feeling particularly antsy with each other, we'd have played a game of Diplomacy just to really kick things off,
Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, it was Samurai Swords was the first game that we actually decided to come up with our own rules. There were some elements of the game where we thought, because we played it so many times, 2 or 3 times a week for over a year, that we thought, right, this bit of the ninja is wrong, and this this sea route seems to be a bit wrong. And so we modified the rules to kind of tweak things up for us, because we'd all played it so many times. That was the first time I actually got into dabbling with rules.
And so, you talk about role-playing there, and you're about 10 years younger than Alan, right?
He's following in my footsteps, you see, 10 years later.
So what was the first D&D? Are you a sort of classic red box D&D?
Yeah. I didn't play the red box with anybody at all. I just bought it and read it and loved it. And I did the natural thing, which is to sort of come up with my own tables of things. And then when I went to Polytechnic, that's when I met my mate Malcolm, and he loved D&D and had been doing D&D for long. So he was GMing a long campaign, and we all joined in. And we used to go over to his place on a Thursday because we had no lectures on a Friday. So we would go there Thursday afternoon after lectures, buy the beers, and just basically spend that entire long weekend role-playing, listening to War of the Worlds, smoking, drinking, falling asleep, having water pistol fights in the middle of the night, that kind of stuff. And really, really got into role-playing that way. It was fantastic.
I mean, this is a question to both of you. How important do you think that RPGs, especially D&D, are to the current gaming world? Do you think it's one of those fundamental pillars on which gaming is built?
I think so. I mean, I was at college in '75, and shortly that we started at that stage doing D&D when it first came over to the UK, the white box version, rather than the red box. But that was introduced to us by Lou Pulsifer, or I should say now Dr. Lou Pulsifer. He was doing his PhD then. I think he was one of these people who was supposed to be spending a couple of years in the UK doing a PhD and ended up spending 5 years or something. I hope I'm not maligning him. But he introduced us to D&D, and he'd played D&D with some of the, I'm not sure if he actually played with Gygax, but those kinds of people. So he learnt it from those, and he introduced that to us. It's very tactical because it was based on wargaming, on chainmail and things like that. He introduced that to us, and we played a very, very tactical version of that. But that was certainly for us quite a seminal experience in terms of, oh wow, this is unusual. This isn't just, it's not a normal game. This is something revolutionary and radical. And of course, because I remember when we were first reading the rules, we were thinking, you can't play this game. It's completely impossible. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So basically, you had to make it up. Which is great, because it means you're automatically into that. Oh well, my thief wants to climb a wall. How do I know if I'm going to fall off? I look up the rule. There's nothing in there. There's not. So we have to make something up. So you're automatically having to make rules up, or just go free Kriegspiel on it. But generally, you want to have some kind of framework, and the D&D rules are a very, very loose framework. So that automatically stimulates you to actually look at gaming as something that you can create in, which is great. So I think that's how it was revolutionary and radical from my point of view. It also helped that Lou Pulsifer, who designed Britannia, amongst other things, was our I was going to say mentor almost in a way. I mean, because he taught us D&D, but he also put me on the track of how I never realized you could actually get games published, you see, till I met Lou. Because I met somebody who'd actually had stuff published. And I went, wow, you can actually, in my naivety, I thought you can make money out of this. That's not true, not even now, but theoretically you can make money out of it. And that put me on that track. So I think D&D was RPGs are radical.
So you've both talked about Alan is precocious and designing Formula One games at the age of 3 or whatever. Tony, you're rejigging Samurai. Do you think that both of you are, because I've sort of flirted with the hobby game world since I was a kid, but it's only sort of in the last, I guess, 8 years that I've really dived into it. And the idea of having my name on a game box is very appealing. But I can't imagine where to start. My brain doesn't work in that way. I'm quite creative, but not in that way. Do you think you both had a natural aptitude to think in these sort of systematic ways? Tony, does it come naturally to you?
I think I was always very creative. I love writing, and I always loved writing. And I've got some very weird little stories I wrote at primary school. My headmaster was really good at primary school. He said, if you want to write a story, give me a chapter breakdown and a quick summary of the story, and I'll give you all the paper. And then you can draw a picture for the cover, and we'll hang it on the wall, and all the other kids can read the story. And when I started at that school, there were maybe 2 stories hanging from the pegs that other children had written. And I very quickly took over the entire shelving with my little books hanging. There were Tarka the Otter type stories. There were action adventure Alistair MacLean type stories, all in about 25 pages, but I made it from a beginning to a middle to an end. And it was my headmaster's, bless him, encouragement of that creativity. So I've always loved writing. And even when I was going to do a journalism degree, that was my original idea, but I failed all my A-levels, didn't get the right grades. So I ended up just sort of knocking in onto a computer course on clearing, which is, the sweeping up of all the spare spaces. And really enjoyed it, but I was cartooning and I was writing all the way through all of that. So, I think from my perspective, it comes from it's just a creative thing. And what I found with board games, especially when I started playing Magic the Gathering, was how I could express my creative storytelling side in a different medium that wasn't just a picture or a block of text. There was another way of expressing those feelings. So the Black Overcoat game became something that was born in that early fecund period. Bloody Legacy started out as a game called Food Fight because we had such terrible food in the canteen where I worked that we used to take the mick out of it. And I made this game up. Copper Twaddle just came out as a Mornington Crescent type moment where I thought I want to make a game where you just pretend you know what you're doing on the board with fancy pictured cards. And then there's a game called Ecology about clearing up the planet and putting the animals back into their homes. And that became Over the Engine, ultimately, the whole thing behind that. So really, for me, it was more a drive to be creative. And then board games, and it was particularly when I met Alan, when we were playing Magic the Gathering together, that I realized there was a lot more out there than just Magic the Gathering and Monopoly and Cluedo and a couple of things you might see in Toys R Us, and plus Risk and all the things I'd seen before. Alan had Euro games. I'd never heard of these things before. And Shocko and Co. was the first Euro game I actually played, a proper game. And he brought it over to the house and we played it. And it's like, this is great.
It's interesting that you mentioned clearing. Because
by the way, before we carry on, I had an unconditional offer to drama school, so I don't need to associate with this riffraff, quite honestly.
I know my place.
It's quite possible. Did you go through PCAS for clearing Polytechnic?
Yeah.
Because I wrote the manual. Manual, literally.
Alan forged me in the hot flames of PCAS.
Because when Tony says writing, Tony was doing creative writing, and when I left university, I was doing educational admin, which was it was actually not a career choice.
It's sexier than you think, Ben.
No, it's not. Well, to be fair, my first office was all women, but that's a different story.
Nothing wrong with that. It's the 21st century, Alan.
Hey, there was no internet. There was no camera phones at that time. No evidence.
So I mean, I ended up working for the Polytechnic Central Admissions System, PCAS, and as publications officer, which had a very loose job description, which was basically, if it's got print on it, Alan's responsible for it. So since we had printed envelopes, I was responsible for buying envelopes as well as writing. I wrote the guide for applicants of ECAS. When I say wrote, because we didn't have much number of computers, I actually literally hand wrote the whole of the guide for applicants by hand. So all those all those Polytechnic entries that you saw, I had handwritten them all. Damn it! Hello to people out there.
I'm saying hello to Doug and Shelley in the States. Doug and Shelley Garrett,
Yay!
Garrett Things and Geekiness.
Yes.
Second best podcast on
second best.
I did say second best. Good. I did say.
So while I was doing the clearing, I actually also dabbled in writing some short stories. So I dabbled in creative writing, and I decided I could either go down that creative writing route or I could design games, and there was no real contest. So I decided to go down the designing games and not make any money. That was the basic choice.
So this is a bit of a digression, but I think it's interesting, and I might regret getting Tony on this kind of subject. But you're both parents. You've both been through school systems and had children who've gone through school systems. And I think it started with my generation at school that there was a very great focus on your education is about providing grist to the industrial mill. You're not supposed to be creative. You're not supposed to think. You're supposed to just get qualifications and get a job. Yeah. Do you think that trend, firstly, is that trend still ongoing? And secondly, do you think we have done a disservice to our children making education solely about that? Because when I hear stories of a headmaster encouraging you to write novellas in primary school, it seems to me that is fundamental in not just making a consumer and a worker bee, but also someone who can contribute to the, whether that be micro or macro environment in which they live.
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked in educational admin, mainly in bureaucratic organizations, and it's all based on qualifications, and it's nuts. I mean, I suppose I can say that in a position of privilege, in that I have got a good degree. I've already been through the mill. I've got all the credentials. But it's the fact that everything is about qualifications, and that school children and young adults are put through this, that, you've got to have qualifications to make something of yourself. That's the be all and end all.
It's a lie.
And
It's an enormous lie.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't remember any particular pressure. I mean, people were saying, like, I know my dad wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer, because he's an aspirational person and he wanted his son to do aspirational things. I just wanted to go to college because I'd heard it was a lot of fun. And so even when I couldn't get into the course I wanted, I still wanted to go to college. And the government was kind enough to pay you some money at that point, so you didn't have to run up a huge debt. And there was a real feeling, and we're talking to early to mid 80s now, that when you got to that level of education, you were allowed to enjoy yourself for the first year. The whole point of university and polytechnic was to learn something about yourself, as well as about the things that you were doing. So if you chose a subject of computing, the first year wasn't very difficult. It was just going to sort out the wasters from the people who had some application to do the work. But it was about learning to be who you are and survive by yourself and cook for yourself, and socialize and all that kind of stuff. Now that kind of stuff is pushed to one side, and that the idea that you could go to college now and spend your first year joining role-playing clubs or doing sports seems a bit odd, because you're spending an awful lot of money that you in theory got to pay back at some point. And why would you fritter it away doing nothing when you should be doing something to get a good result at the end of it? So it is unfair pressure. It's unfair pressure on children in school, in the earlier schools, and it's unfair pressure to be there I know several friends whose children are now back at university, and they're paying thousands and thousands of pounds for student accommodation, but they're sitting in their accommodation doing Zoom lectures. And they could have done that from home, and they wouldn't have to have spent $4,000 on accommodation for the winter term. So regardless of the situation we find ourselves in, there are plenty of people who enjoy taking the money off them still. So not only are they losing the money, they're losing the money in an environment where they're worried about becoming sick. They can't see their friends and family very easily. And they're not even getting the best possible education that can be delivered by their establishments. So aside from COVID, I still think, I agree with Alan, it's just not a very playful environment. It is about, get in there, get the qualifications, get out there, get a decent job, earn the money, contribute to the tax system, fit in your
I think education is very, very, very important. I mean, I think it's some of the most important thing that young people and old people can have is having an education. Learning how to learn is absolutely vital. The fact that is converted largely by successive governments into, you must get the piece of paper that says you can do X. That's the real difficulty. And that's really quite sad, because we lose the purpose. The purpose isn't to get the qualification. The purpose is to learn how to learn, know how to do things, gain life experience. And okay, yes, if you're a medical doctor, I think it's quite important that you do actually have the qualification as well, obviously. Because I mean, there are certain professions where you need to have the qualification, which actually does state that you are good at this thing.
You don't have to be a Puritan to do that. There are plenty of people who spent the first year of medical college stealing body parts and leaving them in bars and stuff and messing about and getting pissed, because that's part of growing up, as part of doing what you do. I spent 50 quid in 1986 on an electronic drum synthesizer and an amplifier to go with it. I neither played the drums, nor did I have £50 to spend on this stuff. That point, I got a £700 grant. So £50 is 1/14 of my allowance for the entire term. And I spent it on a drum synthesizer. Now, I learned a lot about myself the following year, when my bank restricted me to 35 quid a week, and I had to pay my rent and get my food and pay my bus pass out of that 35 quid. So, I learned my lesson, and I've never played the drums since.
I think it's fatal to rob children of the chance to experience their youth, right? I mean, I think you're in an ideal opportunity. You're young, you're stupid, you want to spend all the money, you want to drink all the alcohol, and you want stories to tell when, the anxiety of your oncoming death is forever present. You want to have a place that you can retreat to where you just didn't care. And I think it's a tragedy that the children today are being robbed. And this is why you see I've got to that age now where I can talk about generations beneath me, and they all seem frightfully serious. And I think that's an issue. Anyway, away from the politics. So,
you started it.
yeah, I did. So you've got Alan, and he's designing war games, working in the wargaming community. You've got Tony, you playing role-playing games, buying drum synthesizers, having a ponytail, in fact.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So how important, how fundamental, how seminal in your lives is Magic the Gathering?
Oh, the MTG. Oh dear.
It's very, very important for me. I mean, I wouldn't have met Alan without it. I wouldn't have met Mark Stansfield, a mutual friend of ours, without playing Magic. I wouldn't have met a great many fantastic people in the subsequent 6 or 7 years where I was playing it seriously, had I not played that game. I wouldn't have worked out how I could do a board game version of my Black Overcoat cartoon instead of a weird action point, multi-million chip nonsense thing. It introduced me to effectively multi-use card mechanisms in a very simplistic way, but into probability, into presentation, into combinations, firing combinations off of effects between cards and within decks and across decks, and it's absolutely fundamental to it, to who I am as a gamer. It's incredibly important.
Alan,
not so much. I mean, I did get quite addicted to it. I think Tony and I both did, and it was an interesting experience, and it was, I think it was actually quite instrumental in making communities out of people. So we used to go to Cricklade near Swindon on the regular run down there, and it was the same kind of people. We'd meet up and we'd chat and we'd play Magic the Gathering and commiserate or celebrate as appropriate. I think in terms of the game, again, it's one of those. It's a bit like the role playing thing. It's another one of those moments in game design history, if you like, where it's just that weird thing. Somebody thought, well, Richard Garfield thought of that idea of collectible card games, because card games existed, obviously, and there were collectible cards of various types. I used to collect T cards. I'm ticking many geek boxes.
But were there games? Were there this kind of combat games within a packet of cards?
I don't think it's the game itself. I think the fact that Magic was so strong in generating a community quickly, and that community has persisted, and that's what role playing did. It brought people together with a common interest. So Magic the Gathering as a game is very good, but there are games that do elements of it a lot better. I mean, the biggest problem with Magic is you can get too much land, you get not enough land. Despite how well you build your deck, you can be screwed just by the pure luck of the draw. But it's not about that. It's about 25 years later, you have more people than ever. In fact, there's more people now than there probably has been playing Magic up until now. Added together,
it's also
grown exponentially.
It's also instrumental that it came up either at or shortly before. Was it shortly before? Whereas when the internet more or less started, it's grew up with that, so it was taking advantage of all that social network.
Why then? So you were around at the beginning. I was very tangentially around for about 5 minutes, and frankly, it didn't really wow me, Magic. And living in Cowpat City, I didn't have a lot of people to play with either. But why? We're talking about more people than have ever played it in the past playing Magic. That it started a community instantly. Why? What is it about Magic? Is it the game mechanisms? Is it the stories it tells? What is it?
It's a level of accessibility and the fact that it actually had a pretty cheap entry point. You could just buy a deck, and there you are. You could get straight in.
It had returns as well, because some cards were worth a lot more than you originally paid for them. So it was a game that very quickly.
Yeah. It had collectible elements and the game lots of different types of people could do it. Yeah, I mean, some people would just collect and swap things and make large amounts of money out of stuff. Other people would do deck design. Other people would specialize in actually playing. So it had those different strands of community. You don't get that I suppose you get that in role playing in the sense that some people will be dungeon masters or games masters, and other people just quotes just players. But in Magic the Gathering, you've got collectors, you've got people who are casual players, you've got tournament players, you've got people who are specializing in specific types of deck design. It's got a multi-stranded community, and that's
your media,
quite rare in a game. That's quite rare in games.
Your point about the media is really important. About the internet is really important, because the media element that went with Magic, the players, that was something that suddenly became accessible. Before that, you'd have to buy a magazine. Now you have to find a shop that would sell the magazine in the first place. But with the internet, you could get all the information you needed about it instantly, without costing you any money, without having to go anywhere to find it. It came to you. So the community was exponentially growing because of all the websites that would tell you how to build the best decks, what was coming, the rumor mill, what cards were now suddenly 5 times the value that you paid for them last week. It became a roller coaster. Now you see the media has been building slowly alongside the board gaming. It sort of started picking up in the mid to late 2000s. But with Magic, it had only been around a year and a half, and suddenly the internet was there. And the Duelist magazine didn't last for much longer. Neither did Inquest and the others, because the internet just did everything that the print media could do. I think it is that synchronicity of timing. The game itself is not that great. It's good fun, but it's not that great. But everything else about it is superb.
The advantages of it in terms of the internet age, of course, is the expandability. It's not one game. It's like an ever-changing, I don't know, a spiral. I don't know. It just can keep growing all the time. Well, which is an advantage and disadvantage. It was one of the first ones where you could, for the company, you could, of course, shed loads of money on it because it's an ever-expanding thing, and you've got a captive market to an extent.
Well, you end up with a company like Wizards of the Coast, this tiny independent that were producing, was it White Wolf role-playing media? Tiny fringe element. Magic came along, and they ended up buying TSR and then being sold to Hasbro. So a company that started as nothing grew to be something that bought the very things that it had kind of been following in the coattails of.
I mean, to what degree is it? So one thing I was into as a kid was Panini sticker albums, right? And I could spend hours and hours. I would eschew sweets and pocket money just to buy stickers. And I could sit there for hours and open the stickers and look at them. But of course, there was no game there. There was just sticking them in a book, right? Seeing what you had. To what degree is the booster the
swap
propellant in Magic's success?
It's the killer app. It's the killer app. It really is. Yeah, definitely the killer app.
I've got 3 of these. Can I have one of those for 3 of these?
It's a. I remember Well, Tony's the one doing the. I wasn't really a collector. Tony was more of a collector and trader type, I guess.
Yeah. Well, my friend Rob, God rest him, he was out of work for the longest time, and he couldn't afford Magic cards, but he loved playing. I bought him a starter set revised edition as a birthday present, and I vowed that I would get him a Black Lotus, and it took me about 18 months, but I traded, and somebody actually gave me in a trade an international edition Black Lotus, which is a gold bordered card. At the time, it was worth nothing. It was worth absolutely nothing at all, and somebody just gave it to me in a trade. So for his next birthday, I gave him this Black Lotus. And then we would play, and he would play his deck, and he would have his Black Lotus in it and everything else. It's great. And it was pizza bread, apparently. Yes, I'd love some pizza bread, thank you. Yes.
I'm the talent. I'm the talent here, and I'm not being brought food. This is
well, there you go. But I'm thinking about pizza bread now.
and so I interviewed Richard Garfield. Hear the clang as the name gets dropped. And, he was, I guess the best word, he prevaricated on the whole secondary market thing. And he claimed it was never his intention for there to be a secondary market and all of that sort of stuff. What do you think of the secondary market for Magic? Do you think it's bloody outrageous? Or do you think it's fine?
Since I sold my Magic collection, it funded me for the next 2 Essence purchases of games. And some of the travel as well. I think I'm very in favour of the secondary market. But
it's no different to baseball cards. Baseball cards are probably the biggest thing. They've been hugely valuable for the longest time. And if people want to spend $250,000 on one card that they'll never take out, they'll never handle it, they'll never play it in a deck, well, it's an investment opportunity. It becomes investment after a certain point of view. So, it's whatever. It's whatever it is.
I just want to say to anyone watching this before we go on, if you have any questions for Alan and Tony that you want to put to them, and nothing is too indecent, then hold them till the end, and then we'll have a sort of 5-10 minute Q&A sesh, and they can tell you all the deepest, darkest secrets of their soul. So you're into Magic at this time. What is the British Magic scene like at this time? How many people are playing? Is it huge? Is it full? Is it replete with objectionable people?
Yes, it is. It was appalling. Absolutely rizzle. I mean, there were some terrible, terrible people in it. There were some terrible chances. There were cheats. There were scroungers. There was a guy that would prey on you. There was a guy in our club in Cheltenham who would try and do swaps. We all had little printouts of revised edition lists, and we would tick them all off because we all desperately wanted to get all 360 cards or whatever it was. And he would go around going, I've got some Armageddon clocks and some ebony horses for trade. Has anybody got any dual lands that they don't want? And he would trade us all this shit for... because we wanted them for our sets for all the spare dual lands that we have. And a dual land is like $1,000.
Yeah.
But even back then, he realized that these were valuable cards, and he was preying on the noobs. But Alan and I used to meet up there were a couple of pubs where we used to meet up to do trading and play our decks. And we tried playing for Ante a couple of times. It never really worked out. But more often than not, we started meeting to play other games. We were playing stuff that Mark was thinking about, or we played Middle Earth, the TCG as well, didn't we? Around at Mark's place one time.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
And we played Black Overcoat game, and we started doing things that weren't Magic. And that's when Alan and I realized, I realized that he had a history in actually board game publishing, because he hasn't mentioned it up to now. He mentioned playing games. He hasn't mentioned that he had a minor career in the 80s actually publishing it.
So let's go to that then. You published games in the 80s. What were they? What was your success rate like? What kind of money did you make? And what did you learn about the industry at that time?
Right. Okay. The first game I ever designed that was anything like publishable was a game called City of Sorcerers, which was a fantasy board game. That was in the days when you had to do it on a BBC Micro, and it was all like, it's horrendous. Changing things is just really difficult before we got proper DTP and word processing and stuff. And I designed this game, and I thought, well, Lou's been published. Why can't I get published? So I hawked this around. Well, actually, I sent a copy to a little-known publisher called Games Workshop, and a couple of guys called Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson looked at it, and I'm proudly the possessor of a rejection from Games Workshop, quite properly, to be honest, because it wasn't that great. So I didn't make it with Games Workshop at that stage. So mind you, I think at that point they'd only published 4 games. Their first 4, do you remember those? Warlock and what was it? Oh God, Valley of the Four Winds, things like that.
Well, I've just fixed up an appointment to have Ian Livingston on my show, so
that
will all become clear at some point in the future.
So I went to some other UK-based companies, of which there were about 3, I think, at the time, probably. And a little-known company called Standard Games and Publications actually was looking for stuff to publish. Now, I subsequently found out that was probably largely because they were basically a printing company rather than a games publishing company, and they were really looking for things that they could print. It didn't much matter what they were printing, to be honest. And so they accepted my game City of Sorcerers, and that was published. It was illustrated by again a little-known guy called Gary Chalk, who eventually became a director of Standard Games and Publications. So we worked on that. And then that game came out in '83 and plummeted to the bottom rapidly. I think we sold a few hundred copies. But actually, since they were a printing company, the actual production costs are really low, and they weren't that worried. But they had a they had a series of games which they'd started to publish, which was the Cry Havoc series, which was a medieval skirmish game. And rather interestingly, Standard Games and Publications had already advertised that they were going to do the second game in this series, and it was going to be called Siege, and it was going to be published in about 9 months' time. And they hadn't actually got any form of design at all for it. Well, I think Gary had dabbled with some pictures, but then Gary's an illustrator, not actually wasn't really a game designer at that point. And since I had a history and war studies background from my university time, and I was game designing, and I'd done some amateur war game design, I designed a game called Siege, and that was done, like I say, it was done in 9 months flat. So it was very focused, very concentrated, and that is still my #1 selling game, which it sold significantly large numbers for the time, particularly for a UK game. So,
and this is why you're a multimillionaire now. Then
this is exactly why I'm living the life of a luxury billionaire in my yacht in Warboys. Yeah. So I mean, at the time, I look back at some of the records. It was probably a few £1,000s, which back in the mists of time was actually quite a lot of money. But it was nothing like.
I mean, it's a lot of money for me now. I mean, frankly, 10 quid's a lot of money for me now.
You couldn't live on the amount of money I was getting for that. And I also designed a couple of other games for Standard Games, but we had a rather large falling out, largely because I think none of them are around now. So they were, shall we say, possibly not entirely legitimate in some of their dealings. And they, for example, we had a contract. We did have proper contracts, which is it's quite radical, but they weren't paying me any royalties. Now, I having, since my sister is an accountant, I was able to get an accountant in there, and it turned out that it was largely through sheer incompetence that I wasn't getting any royalties, and eventually I did get paid, so that was good. But one thing they never told me, which is I found out several years later, they'd licensed the game to a French company, and there was about 20,000 copies of the game being printed in French, which I never got anything for at all. So I learned a lot about the industry, but through a particular lens, if you like.
The lens of being ripped off.
The lens of being ripped off, really. But that's why nowadays I want a long-term relationship with companies and other people rather than short-term money grabbing.
Anyway, so
that was all great fun.
So I picture a crowded nightclub, smoke, thumping music, and two gentlemen stood at the opposite sides of the dance floor, and their eyes meet fleetingly, and they come together during the chorus of Too Shy by Kajagoogoo. And from then on, a 20-year relationship is born. But how did you two actually meet?
Well, I think we met at the Magic the Gathering Club.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, next question.
I painted this beautiful picture of 1980 success, and this is what
we met. We met across a crowded pub with handlists full of trading cards.
Yeah.
But what happened is that Alan and I both decided that being permanent employees was too much of a pain in the arse and not getting us enough cash. So we both decided to become sort of self-employed contractors at roughly the same time.
Yeah.
And because I knew Alan, and I knew Alan had a sister who was an accountant. I got Alan's sister was my accountant for my IT business. And so we basically left the safety and comfort of permanent employee to become contractors. And that gave us a little bit more money than we were expecting. Certainly from my perspective, after my first proper contract, I was quitsing. I was like, what the hell am I supposed to do with all this money? Because I was still paying myself what I earned at the civil service. And there was all this extra money sloshing around. And given that Alan and I had been talking about games and and producing games and designing games, we decided that it'd be quite fun if we produced a game. And so we talked about the stuff that we were working on at the time. And Copper Twaddle was 54 cards. It should be straightforward, easy to make.
Yeah.
Why not do something with that?
So before we get there, Where were you, Tony, design-wise at this point? So Alan's a veteran of the industry.
I had a
Where
notebook.
were you?
I had a notebook full of stuff, and I had a couple of prototypes. I had the fast food stuff, the food fight game. I had a Black Overcoat game in various forms, including one that was rejected by Roger Hayworth at Gibson Games, but it'd come along a long way working with Roger. And I had Ecology, which would become Ivor, and I had a few things. I had notebooks basically and a few prototypes. But Copper Toddle was probably the one that was the most advanced. And at work, I had access to a photocopier and a printer that never ran out of ink. So that was really good for knocking together the prototypes.
To be fair, I think the key thing here on Copper Twaddle was not just that Tony had this game which he'd been designing, but it had been play tested. He'd been playing it with people at work or whatever in lunchtimes and things like that. It had been played a lot, so it wasn't a new thing which was suddenly here's this weird new. Well, it was new obviously, and it was weird, but it had been played a lot, so it was relatively mature. It worked. I mean, I think.
But what made you two decide? What was it about your relationship that made you decide we'll start a company together?
Well, we both wanted to design. We both wanted to design games, and we were both. Well, neither of us knew what we were doing. Did we really? And we didn't know what we were doing in terms of how to get games published properly. I mean, I got games published through Standard Games, but that wasn't, as you can know from what I said earlier, it's not a happy thing. So and since then we've been playing Magic the Gathering. My Standard Games and Publications was in the late 80s, and we were doing Magic for ages after that. So it's like 10 years later, was it? I think. When did we publish? Copper Troll came out in
1999.
1999 was Surprise Stare Foundation, so it was like 10 years or so later. So neither of us knew anything much about the current state of play in board games. And I way back when I was doing the Standard Game stuff, I used to go to the Earl's Court Toy and Games Fair, but I hadn't been there for like 10 years, so I knew nothing really about the new industry, and I didn't know much. I knew that there were these other board games coming out of Germany, but I didn't know much about how to get into that. But that seemed like the right route to go. And for that, I figured we needed to have some method that we could pool our resources. And having a company seemed like the best way. I mean, I previously had a solo company called Griffin Games, which I published one game with in the late 80s, called Starship Tycoons, and that was my one previous solo effort at production, and I learned a lot on the grounds that when you cock things up, you learn a hell of a lot. So I managed to make all the mistakes that I possibly could in one game, and so that was quite enlightening.
And so
by the time we got to Surprise Stare Games and talking about that, I had a background in publication, so I knew how to get print made, because I was doing that through my real employment, and we both were doing game design. So
I got two questions. So firstly, Surprise Stare, where does the name come from? Why did you decide on that? And secondly, what was the original conception, the original brief for the company? Or did you not have one? Did you just sort of go, oh, we'll do this and it'll be great?
Well, we were going to design games for other companies. It was our original thought. We thought we'd do Copper Twaddle because it was straightforward to do. It's a card game, comes in a box, you need some artwork, and that's it. It should be straightforward to produce, no complicated components. And we thought we would do is we go and show this, we'll sell that, and what we'll do is we'll use the I'd never heard of Essen, so we found out about that and we went to Essen. And the idea was that we would actually design for other people. We would design for corporate stuff. We would design for other games companies. We thought it'd be easy, it'd be fine. Because when we first went to Essen in 2001, I think it was, I think there were maybe 350 exhibitors. I think that was it, 300 to 350. It wasn't a huge number of exhibitors. And bearing in mind that a third of those weren't board games at all. They were comics and medieval armor and LARPing stuff and mead brewers and quite a lot of Magic the Gathering stalls as well in Hall 6 at the time. Halls 5 and 9 tended to be the indies. Halls 4, 5, and 9. Yeah. So in those halls, you could probably get about 100 stands in total. So yeah, that was the idea. And then we very quickly were disavowed of that notion because everyone was saying, well, no, we don't want to publish this, and we haven't got any space for that, and we've got designs for the next 3 years.
Yeah. There were very, very few publishing slots, and it was mainly a German-based industry. I mean, there were hardly any UK designers like us starting out, so it was very difficult to even though
we met Martin Wallace before Age of Steam came out. I mean, I remember him and John Borer and me sharing, when me and John Borer certainly were bumming fags off each other at Nuremberg in about 2001, sort of smoking and chewing the fat about board games. And John had just sold Transamerica, I think, to Winning Moves, and was complaining he had so much money sloshing around. He had to spend it, otherwise the US tax would have it all. So he was literally flying around the world to take his designers, the Winston Game guys, out for lunch and supper because he had to get rid of the money. It was a ridiculous licensing deal that he got because Transamerica sold a bucket load, didn't it, Alan? It was multi-million seller.
Oh yeah,
corking little game.
We wore out one copy. You had to buy another one.
Yeah. So back in those days, you could, there weren't that many people to speak to. Martin and Warfrog and all the pals that did their Hammy and Jeff and all those guys, Chris Dearlove, all the usual crew. It's quite a closed shop. We were there as the British, and it was really difficult to get in with anybody else, really. I mean, there weren't many others. There were the Brits, the Germans, maybe a couple of French companies there. Yeah. It was quite small, wasn't it? It was
quite small. Yeah. I mean, we didn't really talk about the founding of the company. We founded it as a limited company, because that seemed the way to go. And because my sister is an accountant, she could advise us on that. So that was very straightforward. We didn't spend a huge amount of money, but we invested quite a lot in the games production. And really, with Copper Twaddle, we were aiming at kind of showcasing what we could do. I think that was the main purpose of Copper Twaddle. So we went to town a bit on the print, so that their cards were very high quality card stock. So that we had copies of Copper Twaddle that were played throughout the whole of Essen, and by the end of the Essen, they were still easily playable. They weren't flimsy stuff. And I think from that point of view, it kind of worked. But we weren't really at that stage. We weren't really commercial.
And so before we go on to the Q&A, tomorrow we'll come back to the building of the company. But one last question: how surprised would the Alan and Tony of 20 years ago have been to realize that the company would still be going in 2020?
We'd be really surprised, I think, because I was always worried. Personally, I was always worried that we would end up like a couple of the companies that we first sort of boothed together with at Essen. So you would often find yourself year on year opposite or next to the same companies. Yeah. And quietly we would start seeing certain companies just not come back again.
Yeah.
And we were very keen on making sure that anything we did well with, any money, we would plow into the next project. So at least it would keep the company going. But it was very much, we had to keep it going ourselves. So we paid for our own accommodation. We paid for our own travel expenses. It couldn't even afford to pay for the booths, Surprise Stairs itself. We just wanted to keep it going just to keep it going, really, to give ourselves space. And as you'll find out over the next few sessions, we had a couple of moments where it could have all gone awfully, awfully wrong. We were actually growing at the same time as the industry was growing, and it was opening up, and so we sort of rode that wave. And I think we were quite prudent, actually. We didn't overstretch ourselves. But yeah, what do you think?
For example, yeah, I agree. For example, we never considered, like, well, not seriously anyway. I think we might have dreamed of it. Never considered like ditching our day jobs and actually just going full time into the company, because I think we had a bit of we'd seen other people do that and come a cropper. So we felt, especially we both had young families, or at least Tony had a young family. We had a family. So we didn't want to take unnecessary risks. I think that was it, and we wanted to use it as a vehicle for our game designs. That was the basic thing, was we wanted a vehicle for our game designs. We weren't looking at it as, we can make vast amounts of money by publishing games per se, although I think we always dreamed of that, didn't we, Tony? We dreamed that we might suddenly make a huge amount of money. That's related.
No, I think our first goal was to sell a game to somebody else. I think that was the idea. If we could actually get another company to spend their money producing a game that one of us had designed, that for us would be really, really great. That would be an achievement unlocked.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you're working in a good industry, and we would just come through the year 2000 IT situation, which is very lucrative for a lot of IT consultants, it's very easy to produce a game if you've got the money to produce it. It's less easy to make any money back off it, but you can say, oh, I'm a board game publisher just by throwing endless wads of cash at it. But if somebody else comes along and says, no, actually, I think that's good enough for me to spend my money on it, that is something very valuable indeed. And that's what I think we were really hoping for. Whether somebody would just buy the design and print it, or we would do something and then somebody would license subsequent prints from us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, hopefully there are people watching, there are people chatting, and to save my blushes for the last sort of 5 minutes or so, does anybody in the chat have any questions for these two illustrious doyens of British game design?
I'm just looking through the chat for any questions here.
Well, everyone's saying hello to each other, which is really good.
Yeah,
That's good. Yeah.
Not listening to us, but just saying hello to each other, which is rather lovely. See, we can build a community too.
Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Why would we be listening to you? Says David.
Thanks, David.
Okay, Alan, you answer that question first. Why would David be listening to you?
I don't think he ever does he?
Masochistic.
I don't think
deeply masochistic.
Key Market wouldn't exist without Surprise Stare. If it hadn't been for Book of Days being demoed to Richard Breeze at the Surprise Stare,
we have a track record of helping other UK designers to learn from our mistakes and thereby make their own separate individual mistakes rather than the ones that we've already made.
Yes.
That's what we.
So Bears has got a question. What would incite violence in Alan or Tony? Parking, I've seen Tony has a particular issue with.
I'm not quite sure. Alan's been very moderate over the years. He's survived a lot of nonsense from me.
I'm a pacifist at heart.
I think ultimately we both value what Surprise Stare, how Surprise Stare works. It's very much everybody's done a bit of everything through the years. You know, we have our unsung heroes. We have Charlie, who did all the art and production layout stuff before we started hoi polloying, mixing with the Clemens Frances of the world. Charlie did all of that stuff for us. Vicky got her first bits of illustration work for Billy. She did the box art, and then she went on to do the wonderful work for Totemo. I think we have been very fair in our division of labor. We've all got together in the same room and physically packed games from boxes and boxes, separate components. And none of us is really, I mean, I lauded about the place. I have a great fun being Mr. Tony Boydell, the board game designer, but you know, none of what I would do at Essen would be possible without Alan actually organising the fucking hotels. Organising the food.
I think the one thing that nearly got me to violence was an offhand comment by someone who said, "Are you still working for Tony?"
Oh,
and I nearly hit that person, but I didn't.
That's terrible because I try and make it whenever I've spoken to anybody over the last 10 years about anything. I've always been very clear and conscious to make sure everybody understands Surprise Stare is me and Alan and Charlie.
Oh, yes.
And it is a bit rankling sometimes because I'm the mousy one. You know, Alan is the feet under the swan. He's the swan's feet. Yeah, I can sit there looking all calm and serene on the surface, but he's the one that's doing all the bloody paddling.
But there's a whole swathe of stuff we can do later in a later show on why that kind of thing came about, which is fine, and you know, that rankled quite a lot.
So
Charlie would no doubt say.
So this is a question I asked, you didn't answer, but Tabby Sun Lion has reminded. Where does the name Surprise Stare come from?
Yeah. I think that came out of some dark, deep corner of Tony's brain. Actually, I think I
just did a cartoon of somebody looking
Yes,
surprised, and
that's
I
right.
thought it'd be good. What you want is a games company that you'll be surprised at what they do, and we sort of thought the idea would be good to have a variety of products.
There we got
There's
rather
than
thingy.
So you could be a games company that did nothing but railway games. Well, we wanted to be a game where you would think, I'm going to see what they've got at Essen this year, but we have no idea what it is they're going to have. So last year they did a game about medieval whatever it is, and this year they're doing one about family inheritance, and next year they're doing one about Celtic kings. So we like the idea that our games would be not the usual thing.
Yes, something that we haven't got a track record of any form of branding, really. So our games range from Bloody Legacy, which is a kind of very short throwaway card game, up to Confucius, which is a medium heavy Euro. We've even got a set of miniatures rules, which we've done under the Surprise Day Games label. So we tend to design what we like, and we're not, in that sense, we're not commercial. We're not brand. Well, we are brand, but we don't restrict ourselves by our branding. Although, to be fair, now we've got the Pocket Campaign series. That's more of a conventional branding idea.
So, Roog 6, your questions will be answered over the subsequent few days, and I'm sure we'll wrap that up on the final day. That seems like a final day question. And also with Giles Bennett, that also seems like a final day question. And so I guess that no one else has a question. So we'll say thank you ever so much for everyone watching. I hope
thank you.
that I haven't pushed my way in front of incredibly interesting answers. And we'll see you half an hour later than today, tomorrow. And we'll go over the nascent bubblings of Surprise Stare Games.
Lovely.
How to get hold of Tony is below there if you need to get hold of Tony. If you don't
I don't owe anybody any money as far as I know. So
if you don't read his
try
blog,
that one.
If you don't read his blog, that's probably a good thing. But
and I'll try and get my website onto the ticker tomorrow.
Yes, please. That would be great. And mine is here, Alan Port Surprise Day Games. Main email for me, and I have a blog, but no, I'm not a daily blogger. Great. Thanks very much to everybody. Thanks to Ben for chairing us, which has been great.
Yeah. So Alan, Tony, thank you very much.
Bye.